Get out, Sloane. Take that backpack and go. If you walk out to chase this hobby of yours, don't come back. My father's voice ricocheted off the tile and glass of the kitchen like a slammed cabinet door. The overhead light hummed. The pot of coffee he'd forgotten to turn off hissed and spat behind him. My mother stood at the sink, clutching a damp dish towel like a lifeline, eyes fixed on the window as if the scrub pines outside could offer an answer. I set my keys on the counter. They made a small, traitorous sound, like a coin in a collection plate, too polite for what was happening. Knox, my mother murmured, please. Loretta, no. My father's jaw tightened. She's throwing away a real life for candles and clickbait. Hand-poured home fragrance, I said before I could stop myself. The habit of explaining, of proving, had carved grooves in me years ago. Cinder and citron isn't a hobby. It's my business. It's a fantasy, he snapped. No 401k, no insurance, no future. Do you think grown adults live off craft fairs? They had the look of people bracing for a storm, bodies angled, faces set. The irony was a weight in my throat I couldn't swallow. For 2 years and 7 months, I had been quietly wiring money to the company that held the deed to this very house. Every 28th of the month at noon, like a ritual. $2,350. 31 times. $72,850 in total. My bank labeled it recurring vendor, Westline Mortgage. I labeled it don't tell them yet. They didn't know. They couldn't fathom it. To them I was the reckless one. Dad, I said, forcing my voice to stay level, you asked why I want to leave the pharmaceutical firm. I'm answering. I'm building something that's mine. No committees. No bosses measuring my worth in billable hours. And when it collapses? His knuckles whitened on the back of a chair. When the internet gets bored and you've got no resume, no? Then I'll figure it out, I said. Like I always do. His laugh was short and mean. Like you always do. You mean when other people pick up the slack? I swallowed. Other people. I thought about the automated wire rattling through the bank every month. About Loretta's grocery receipts that had shifted from brands to store labels. About the time last winter my father had joked that the new mortgage service was remarkably painless, that it was nice the bank keeps us on track. I had nodded and said nothing. It had felt cleaner that way, anonymous and safer. If I told them, they would weaponize it. They would scold me for earning money the wrong way even as they spent it. Sloane, my mother said softly, finally turning from the window. The towel had left little crescents of damp on her palms. We just want you to be safe. Safe. That word had been blessing and bludgeon in our house. Safety meant predictability. Predictability meant compliance. I'm 29, I said. I want to be safe too. But I also want to be proud. You can be proud at a real company, my father said, as if pride were a benefits package. You had one. You had security. Security. Another word that meant, do it our way. There are moments when the world narrows to a single point like the tip of a needle. I felt that point press against me now, right below the breastbone. I could tell them. I could say, you're standing in a kitchen I've been paying for. You're dismissing a business that has kept the bank from dialing your number. I could watch their faces shift, watch the color drain, watch the calculations begin, shame and gratitude arm wrestling behind their eyes. Instead I reached for my keys. If that's how you feel, I said, then I'll go. My father didn't move. My mother did. She took a half step forward, then thought better of it and reached for the towel again. Outside, Flagstaff's air bit my cheeks, resin sweet with pine. The sky had that late October clarity people write about when they've never lived through it. A hard-edged blue that makes you think of promises and knives. I breathed it in, felt it sting. I could hear my father pacing in the kitchen. The front door was still open a fraction, enough for his voice to slip through. She'll be back, he said. When reality hits. Loretta didn't answer. I let the door ease shut. The click sounded final, like the end of a prayer. Across the street, a neighbor's porch light flickered. Somewhere a dog barked once and gave up. My car sat in the driveway where I'd left it, as if this were just another Sunday dinner and not the moment I'd been circling for months. On the passenger seat, my laptop bag gaped open. The edges of invoices and shipping labels fanned out like wings. The last batch of orders had gone to places with names that felt like tiny stories. Sugar Land, Texas. Bend, Oregon. Hazleton, Pennsylvania. Strangers had lit wicks and breathed in what I made and sent me money for the privilege. That counted, didn't it? In some math my father refused to learn that counted. I slid behind the wheel and didn't start the engine. The house glowed behind me, a rectangle of warm light carved out of the dusk. I pictured the ledger I kept, the quiet arithmetic of love I had performed. 31 payments, none of them acknowledged, all of them necessary. When my mother's knee surgery had chewed through their savings 8 years ago, my parents had refinanced. When interest rates climbed, the payment did too. My father called the bank. The bank sent form letters. The letters piled in a drawer next to the takeout menus and rubber bands. The panic wasn't loud, but it was always there, like tinnitus, like a background buzz you stop hearing until someone names it. I named it. And then I handled it. I turned the key, then stopped again, palms pressed to the steering wheel. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked like a girl playing dress-up in a woman's life. Cheeks flushed, hair shoved into a lopsided clip, eyes too bright. Sloane Adair, daughter, dutiful, difficult. The one who learned to make herself useful, then learned to make herself invisible while doing it. My phone buzzed. A text from my younger cousin Lark, who'd always had a flair for checking in at the exact wrong or right time. You alive? I stared at the screen. My thumb hovered. Define alive, I typed, then erased it. Yeah. Just left my parents. 3 dots. How'd it go? They said don't come back. A long pause. Then, you okay? I wasn't sure. Okay. Felt like one of those words people say when they mean, not currently on fire. I typed, eventually, and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. There are scenes you expect to replay for the rest of your life. The way my father's voice had cracked, not with grief but with contempt. The tiny tremor in my mother's hands. The part of me that wanted to beg, just once. Tell me you love me even if you don't understand me. I swallowed hard. Pride can be a kind of hunger. I had fed it too long to starve it tonight. The engine turned over. The radio came on mid-sentence. A talk show host in Phoenix railing about a supply chain report I used to have to read at my old job. I shut it off. Silence rushed in. As I backed out, my headlights washed over the front of the house. I caught a flicker of movement. A shadow crossing the kitchen. Loretta maybe reaching for a mug. Knox maybe reaching for certainty. They would sit, they would pour coffee they didn't need, they would rehearse their lines. They would tell themselves I was impulsive, dramatic, ungrateful. They would not tell themselves that every time the phone didn't ring with a collection call, it was because I had made sure of it. I turned onto Birch Run Road. The pines crowded close, a dark choir. The night opened in front of me, a black ribbon and a dare. Half a mile later the first tears came, hot and unceremonious, the kind that skip warning. I let them. I didn't pull over. I cried and drove the way people in songs do, except real life is messier. My toes ran. My chest hitched. I laughed once at the sheer stupidity of crying with this much mascara on, then cried harder because I had put mascara on to come to dinner like a normal person, like someone whose parents would kiss her cheek and argue about the best pie crust and send her home with leftovers. At the light by the grocery store, I wiped my face with the sleeve of my sweater and forced my breath to slow. The red glow filled the car, made everything look theatrical and fragile. A couple carrying a paper bag crossed in front of me, and for a second I hated them for how easy their evening looked. My apartment sat above a weird old bookstore that sold maps and out-of-print field guides. The landlord had painted the stairs a cheerful yellow that peeled in ribbons every winter. As I climbed, the banister cold under my palm, I felt something loosen. Space. That's what it was. The kind people describe after leaving the dentist, when the thing that hurt has been taken out and you're left touching your tongue to the tender place. Inside, the smell of bergamot and wax lingered from the last batch I'd poured. Boxes lined one wall. Jars, lids, wicks, labels. The printer blinked a little green light, patient. This was the room where I didn't have to explain why a fragrance note called Cedar Rain made sense, where I didn't have to apologize for the spreadsheet that tracked scent throw versus cure time, where I could be the version of myself that didn't shrink. I set my bag down, opened my laptop and woke the screen. A clean, indifferent blue. Numbers arranged themselves obediently. Orders pending, inventory low, payment cleared. 3 email notifications for wholesale inquiries blinked at me from boutiques with names like Juniper, Finch and Tallgrass. In one tab my bank balance gleamed, less than it would be in a week once the next wire went out. I hovered the cursor over the scheduled transfer to Westline. I could cancel it. One click. I could let the reality my father worshipped finally introduce itself at our door, wearing a tie and holding a clipboard. The idea made my stomach go cold. It also made a part of me, the hard little kernel of me that had learned to survive being underestimated, sit up straighter. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a voicemail from my Aunt Miriam, who loved me exactly as I was and made no secret of thinking my father was talented at being wrong. I didn't listen to it. Not yet. I wasn't ready to be comforted. Comfort is a solvent. It can dissolve your resolve if you let it too early. I clicked away from the bank tab and pulled up my production schedule instead. There was a big order due next week from a lodge near Sedona that wanted custom labels for a wedding. I adjusted quantities, typed notes to myself in the margins, things I'd remember without writing down but wrote anyway because writing them made them real. At some point the tears dried. At some point my breathing matched the slow rhythm of the wax melter cooling. At some point a kind of steadiness crept in, the kind built not from certainty but from motion. Do the next thing, then the next. I made tea. I didn't drink it. I stared at the steam until it disappeared. The clock on the stove wore its minutes like an accusation. I ignored it. I drafted a message to my supplier about a delayed shipment and didn't send it. I started a list titled, "What I Will Not Apologize For," and wrote 3 items before I felt ridiculous and shut the notebook. When the phone finally rang, I knew it would be someone who had already decided what I should do. I let it ring. I let it stop. I let the voicemail icon bloom on the screen like a bruise. I walked to the window and looked down at the street. The bookstore's sign swayed. Across the way, a man in a beanie coaxed a reluctant husky along. In a second-floor kitchen, a woman in a bathrobe set a pie on a sill. The world went on, indifferent and kind. Behind me the laptop hummed. The bank tab waited, quiet as a secret. I told myself I had left home because I wanted to be brave. The truth was murkier. I had left because staying meant disappearing in small, polite ways until there was nothing left to leave. I turned back to the desk and sat. I moved the cursor over Edit Recurring Transfer. I didn't click. Not tonight. The house I had just left stood solid in my mind. Stucco and stone, the porch swing my father pretended to hate and never fixed, the hallway where Loretta kept the off-center family photos my father always meant to straighten. I thought of the mortgage company's letters stamped paid. I thought of Knox's voice calling me irresponsible as he drank coffee in a kitchen my money kept warm. Let reality hit, he'd said. Maybe it would. Maybe it should. My finger hovered. The screen glowed. The night pressed its ear to my window and listened. I closed the laptop. Not yet. And in that small not yet, a fault line opened, thin as a hair, inevitable as winter. When I finally closed the door of my apartment that night, the silence pressed down on me like a heavy quilt. I leaned against it for a moment, listening to the hum of the radiator, the faint traffic echo from Ashland Avenue below. It was such a contrast to the chaos I had just walked out of that it almost felt surreal, like I had stepped between 2 different versions of my life. My name is Sloan Adair. I'm 29 years old, born and raised in Flagstaff, Arizona. My parents, Knox and Loretta, built their whole identity around predictability and tradition. Knox worked nearly 4 decades as a claims investigator for a regional insurance firm. Steady, unglamorous work, but to him it was proof of virtue. Loretta spent 25 years as a paralegal before she retired early, her health pushing her out sooner than she wanted. To them, the blueprint for success was simple. Get a respectable job, keep it until retirement, buy a house, raise a family, and never color outside the lines. I was the daughter who refused to follow that blueprint. On paper, I did everything right for a while. I studied hard, went to a good university, landed a corporate job at a pharmaceutical company in Phoenix. Salary, benefits, business cards with my name embossed. For the first year, I tried to convince myself that the numbness I felt every day was just adjusting. But deep down, I knew I was dying inside that cubicle. My mind kept drifting back to the side hustle I had started in college, designing and hand-pouring candles with complex fragrances, packaging them in amber jars with minimalist labels. What had begun as a dorm room craft fair hobby had quietly grown into something much bigger. By the time I turned 27, my business, Cinder and Citron, was earning nearly $8,000 a month. I would come home from my day job, heat wax until midnight, and fill shipping boxes until my tiny apartment looked more like a warehouse than a living space. I was exhausted, but for the first time in my life I felt alive. My candles were selling in boutiques across the Southwest. Strangers emailed me photos of their living rooms glowing with the light of something I had created with my own two hands. And yet, every family dinner, every holiday, every phone call circled back to the same lecture. You're lucky to have a stable job, Sloan. Don't ruin it chasing a fad. What they never realized, what I made sure they never realized, was that their own stability was already balanced on the shoulders of my so-called fad. I found out about their financial trouble by accident. Nearly 3 years ago I stopped by their house on a Sunday afternoon. Dad was out in the garage tinkering with his old motorcycle. Mom asked if I could help her log into the bank's online portal. She'd forgotten her password again. When the screen finally loaded, a half-dozen red notices filled the page. Past due statements. Warning letters. The mortgage was behind. Their savings were practically gone, eaten away by medical bills from Mom's knee replacement and the complications that followed. They had never said a word to me. At dinner they still poured wine and argued about college football as if nothing was wrong. But the numbers didn't lie. That night, sitting in my own apartment with the glow of the laptop burning my eyes, I made a decision. I would not let them lose their home. Not while I could do something about it. The next morning I set up an anonymous recurring payment through my business account. Every month on the 28th, $2,350 wired directly to Westline Mortgage. Clean, quiet, automatic. I told myself I would confess eventually, that when the right moment came, I would explain everything and we'd cry and hug and they'd finally see me for who I was. But the right moment never arrived. Instead, I lived in the shadows of my own generosity. At every Sunday dinner, I bit my tongue when my father bragged that they were managing just fine on his pension and Mom's modest retirement. I smiled tightly when Loretta said she was glad at least Tyler, my younger brother, had chosen a stable career as a high school math teacher. They praised his neat apartment, his steady paycheck, his respectable wife. I was proud of him too, but every word about him carried an unspoken comparison. The message was clear. Why can't you be like him? And all the while my money kept their roof intact. There's a special kind of loneliness in being both indispensable and invisible. I carried that loneliness with me like a second skin. Sometimes, in my most bitter moments, I told myself I liked the secrecy. That I enjoyed being their unseen guardian angel. But the truth was simpler, uglier. I was afraid. Afraid they would dismiss my help as illegitimate because it came from candles and labels instead of a corporate paycheck. Afraid they would take my money but still see me as the failure child. Afraid that no matter what I gave, I would never earn their respect. So I stayed quiet. Month after month I paid. And tonight, standing in their kitchen, listening to my father's voice split the air like an axe, I realized just how much that silence had cost me. The first 3 days after I left my parents' house blurred together, like watching the world through a rain-streaked windshield. I woke up in my little apartment above the bookstore, surrounded by boxes of jars and wax, trying to convince myself it had all just been a nightmare. But every time I checked my phone, the absence of a call or text from them made it real again. My father hadn't reached out. My mother hadn't softened. The people whose mortgage I had secretly been paying for almost 3 years had thrown me out without a second thought. I buried myself in work. Orders had piled up over the weekend and my studio became a battlefield of labels, packing tape and scents thick in the air. Sandalwood, bergamot, clove. I poured until my wrists ached, until the melters beeped at me like impatient children. My business had always been a refuge, but now it felt like the only thing tethering me to the ground. Still, even as I boxed candles and printed shipping slips, the thought gnawed at me. The next mortgage payment was due in just over 2 weeks. The automatic transfer was still set. All I had to do was nothing and the payment would go through as usual. But should it? For the first time since I had set up that system, I hesitated. Why should I keep sacrificing for people who saw me as nothing more than a disappointment? Every time I replayed my father's words, "You're nothing without us," the doubt grew sharper. On the third evening, as the sun slipped down behind the mountains, my phone rang. Tyler. I let it buzz twice before answering, bracing myself. "Hey," he said cautiously, his voice low like he was afraid of waking someone. I heard what happened Sunday." Of course he had. He was there, sitting in the corner like a bystander, watching our family splinter without lifting a hand. "Did you?" I asked, sharper than I intended. Because from where I was standing, you looked pretty comfortable letting Dad throw me out. There was a long pause. I could hear the clink of silverware on his end, maybe Stephanie cleaning up dinner. Finally he sighed. You know how they are, Sloane. They want what's best for you. I laughed, but it came out bitter. No, Ty. They want what's comfortable for them. They want me to live a life they can explain at neighborhood barbecues. Safe. Predictable. Boring. You're not wrong, he admitted quietly. But they don't mean to hurt you. They just don't get it. Exactly, I said. They don't get it. And they never will. Silence stretched between us, heavy and awkward. Tyler had always been the peacemaker, the one who tried to smooth things over, but this time he seemed lost for words. Finally he said, Look, maybe you should come to Sunday dinner anyway. Let things cool off. I stared at the candle I was labeling, the neat black letters blurring. She told me never to come back, Ty. She didn't mean it. She meant every word. Another pause. Then, like he was trying to change the subject, he asked, So, your business? It's doing okay? I almost laughed again. It was thriving. Better than I could have dreamed. But instead I said, better than Dad's pension if you want the truth. That made him go silent. I imagined him blinking, trying to process that. Seriously, he said at last. Seriously, I told him. But I guess it doesn't count. Not to them. We said a few more strained words before hanging up, but the conversation left me restless. Tyler's attempt at smoothing things over only reminded me of the gulf between us. That night I sat at my kitchen table, laptop open, staring at the line item in my banking portal. Recurring payment. Westline mortgage. Next processing date, November 28th. One click and it could be gone. My rational side whispered that I shouldn't punish them financially just because they couldn't accept my choices. But another voice, darker and sharper, told me maybe it was time they saw exactly how much they depended on me. Maybe it was time they learned what life looked like without the daughter they had just thrown away. I closed the laptop without touching the payment. Not yet. But the decision felt like a storm cloud forming on the horizon. Inevitable, waiting. 10 days slipped past after that phone call with Tyler, each one a little heavier than the last. I kept waiting for the phone to ring, for my father's gruff voice to push through the line, for my mother to offer some kind of apology, anything. But the silence was deafening. At first I told myself it was fine. I didn't need them. I had my business, my independence, my apartment above the bookstore that smelled like cedar and ink. But every morning when I checked my email and saw nothing from them, every night when my phone stayed dark, the anger inside me twisted into something I didn't want to name. Hurt. The mortgage payment was still set to go out. The 28th loomed like a deadline I hadn't studied for. I promised myself I'd decide before then. Cancel it or let it run. But in truth I was paralyzed. And then fate made the decision for me. It was a Thursday evening when my phone lit up with Tyler's name. I hesitated before answering, bracing myself for another awkward attempt at peace. But the tone of his voice made my stomach clench. Sloane, he said without greeting, something's wrong with Mom and Dad. You need to know. My chest tightened. What happened? Are they okay? They're not hurt. But they got a notice from the bank today. Something about their mortgage payment being late. The words hit like ice water. Late? What do you mean late? That's impossible. That's what Dad thought too, Tyler said. His voice was strained, hurried, like he didn't want Stephanie to overhear. He called me in a panic. Said the bank threatened to start some kind of action if they don't catch up. He even asked if Stephanie and I could help financially. I gripped the edge of my counter, knuckles white. The irony was almost unbearable. My father was turning to Tyler. Young, newly married, barely scraping by on a teacher's salary, when all along, I had been the one holding everything together. What did you tell him? I asked carefully. That we'd help if we could, Tyler admitted. But Sloane, we can't. Their mortgage is over $2,000 a month. That's more than our rent. I don't know what he's going to do. I closed my eyes, pressing my forehead to the cabinet door. I could see it clearly, the payment glitching. Maybe a hiccup with the bank. Maybe a technical issue. Or maybe, if I was honest, it was my own fault. After the fight, I'd opened the payment tab a dozen times, hovering over cancel. Maybe I had clicked something without realizing. Maybe the system had rejected it. Either way, the safety net was gone. And for the first time in nearly 3 years, my parents were staring down the reality I had been shielding them from. Tyler, I said finally, my voice low, Did Dad seem surprised? Like he didn't understand why the payment hadn't gone through. Yeah, he said. That's what confused me. He said he always thought the mortgage was set up on some automatic program through the bank. Like it was just handled. He didn't realize someone else was making those payments. My throat tightened. Of course he hadn't. Of course he had convinced himself that comfort just appeared out of nowhere, that financial stability was his right. He had never questioned the miracle of bills being paid. Now the miracle had ended. After we hung up, I sat in the dark of my apartment, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. My laptop glowed from the table, still open to the banking portal. The payment hadn't processed. The number that should have read completed, instead said failed. I could fix it in seconds. One transfer, one click, and everything would go back to normal. But I didn't. For the first time, the decision was mine. Not theirs. Not the bank's. I wrapped my arms around myself and whispered into the silence. Maybe it's time they finally see the truth. The words tasted both terrifying and liberating. 3 days passed before my phone rang again. This time, when I saw Tyler's name on the screen, I already knew it wasn't going to be good news. I answered anyway. Sloan. His voice was hushed, like he'd stepped outside to keep the conversation private. I just got off the phone with Dad. Things are bad. Really bad. My pulse quickened. What happened? They called the bank again. The representative told them the account showed payments had been coming from an outside source for years. And then suddenly stopped. Dad was shaken. He said it didn't make any sense. He thought it had been some kind of bank program or an insurance benefit he'd forgotten about. I pressed my hand against my forehead, my chest tight. They were starting to see it. The edges of the truth. And Mom? I asked. There was a pause. She cried, Tyler said finally. Not angry tears, Sloan. She told Dad she didn't know how they were going to manage if the payments didn't start again. She kept saying they'd lose the house. That it wasn't fair. She sounded smaller than I've ever heard her. For a moment I couldn't speak. I pictured Loretta at the kitchen table, hands twisting that same dish towel, tears streaking her face while the walls of the home she loved suddenly felt fragile. It hurt more than I wanted to admit. They asked me, Tyler continued, lowering his voice further, if I thought you might know something about it. Dad said, Sloane's good with money, with computers. Maybe she knows who's been helping us. I let out a hollow laugh. If only they knew. Tyler went quiet and I realized I couldn't keep it from him any longer. He deserved to know even if they didn't. Ty, I said softly, there's something you need to hear. But you have to promise me you won't say anything to them until I decide. Sloan, he sounded wary. What is it? I closed my eyes and forced the words out. I've been paying their mortgage. For the last 2 years and 7 months. Every single month. It's me. The line went dead silent. For a second I thought the call had dropped. Then in a whisper, you've been what? Paying their mortgage, I repeated. Every month. An automatic transfer from my business account to Westline. That's why they've been fine all this time. That's why they never saw those past due notices again. Because I made them go away. Sloan, his voice cracked. That's thousands of dollars. Tens of thousands. Why didn't you tell them? Because every time I tried they mocked what I do. Every time I wanted to explain they told me it was a hobby, a waste of time. How could I admit that their failure of a daughter was the reason they weren't homeless? I could hear him breathing, heavy and uneven. How much? He asked at last. $72,850, I said quietly. Give or take. Another silence. Then, Jesus Christ. Yeah, I said bitterly. Funny how my candles and clickbait could buy them nearly 3 more years in that house. Tyler exhaled, the sound shaky. So, when they kicked you out, I thought maybe it was time they understood exactly what they were rejecting. I cut in. So I didn't fix the payment. I let it fail. Sloan, they could lose the house. I know. My voice was steadier than I felt. And maybe they should know what life looks like without me. For a long moment neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint rush of cars on his end, the world going on like nothing had happened. Finally Tyler said, you have to tell them. They're terrified, Sloan. This isn't just about pride anymore. They told me never to come back, I said, my throat tight. They made their choice. And now, Tyler said, you have to make yours. After we hung up, I sat at my table staring at the bank tabs still glowing on my laptop. My finger hovered over the mouse, trembling. One click and the payment would go through. One click and I'd erase the lesson I wanted them to learn. One click and I'd be their invisible savior again. For the first time in years, I realized the decision was entirely mine. And that terrified me more than anything. 2 weeks crawled by with a heaviness I could feel in my bones. The November wind sharpened, leaves skittered across the streets, and I buried myself in work, pretending I didn't feel the weight of the choice pressing down on me. Then on a gray Sunday morning my phone rang. Not Tyler this time. It was my father. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening, my finger hovering above the green button. I let it ring 4 times before finally answering. Dad. My voice came out flat, cautious. There was a pause. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. Sloan. We need to talk. My throat went dry. About what? About the house. About the mortgage. His words trembled, though I could tell he was fighting to keep control. The bank told us. Someone's been paying it. For years. And then it stopped. He cleared his throat, the sound rough. Tyler said you might know something about it. The silence on my end stretched long enough that I could hear my own pulse in my ears. This was it. The moment I'd avoided for nearly 3 years. I don't just know about it, I said finally. My voice was low, deliberate. It was me, Dad. I've been paying your mortgage. Every single month. For 2 years and 7 months. From my business account. The silence that followed was so complete I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard him inhale, shaky, unsteady. He broke off. That's impossible. Your little side thing, it couldn't. My little side thing brings in around $8,000 a month, I snapped. Those candles you mocked have been the reason you've had a roof over your head. In the background I heard my mother's voice. Knox, what is it? What did she say? He must have put me on speaker because the next moment she was there too, her voice trembling. Sloan, is it true? His mom. While you called my business a waste of time, I was wiring $2,300 to your bank account every month. Quietly. Because I couldn't watch you drown. Oh my God. Her voice cracked. Why didn't you tell us? Because every time I tried you cut me off. Because you never wanted to hear about my business. Because admitting it would have meant you taking my money while still treating me like a failure. Neither of them spoke. And that silence was louder than shouting. Finally my father said, Sloan, please. The bank's threatening foreclosure. We only have 30 days. If you could just what? I cut in. Step in again. Pretend none of this ever happened? Let you keep dismissing me while my money props you up? We didn't mean what we said that night, my mother rushed. I didn't mean to tell you to never come back. I was angry. You did mean it, Mom, I said quietly. You both did. And now you're facing the reality of what life looks like without me. For a long moment, all I could hear was my mother's quiet sobbing and my father's ragged breathing. Then came the words I never thought I'd hear. Please, my father said. The words scraped out of him like it had to be dragged. We're begging you. I closed my eyes, pressing my fingers against them until I saw sparks. Every part of me wanted to crumble, to give in, to fix everything like I always had. But another part, the part that remembered the look of disgust in his eyes, the way my mother's voice had cracked like a whip when she told me to leave, held me steady. You made your choice, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Now you have to live with it. I ended the call before they could respond. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the phone, but I didn't take it back. Not this time. The weeks that followed were like watching a slow-motion collapse. 30 days. That was all the bank had given them. And when the grace period ended, so did the illusion of security my parents had lived in for nearly 3 years. The foreclosure notice arrived first. Official, stamped, cold. Tyler told me about it in a hushed voice one evening, as if saying the words too loud might make them heavier. My parents tried to fight it, of course. They called the bank, begged for extensions, made frantic calculations late into the night. But without those anonymous transfers they had nothing. Dad's pension barely covered groceries and utilities. Mom's prescriptions cost more each month than their Social Security checks combined. And so, 6 weeks after the night I walked out of their house, They packed up 15 years of their life into cardboard boxes and plastic bins. The 3-bedroom stucco house with the red-tiled roof, the one my mother had filled with wind chimes and potted plants, the one my father had always claimed was his castle, was gone. They moved into a cramped rental on the edge of Flagstaff, a dingy 2-bedroom in a complex that smelled like damp carpet and fried food. No more garden for Mom to fuss over. No more big living room for Dad's beloved fireplace. Just white walls, stained carpet, and silence. I didn't go see them. But word travels fast in a town like ours. Neighbors whispered about how sudden the move had been. My mother, once the social hub of the cul-de-sac, stopped answering calls from her old friends. My father, who had carried himself with pride like a uniform, now walked with shoulders hunched, his dignity leaking away in small visible ways. And Tyler, caught in the middle, looked at me with eyes that held both sympathy and quiet judgment. He didn't say the words, but I could feel them in the air. You could have stopped this. But I didn't. Because deep down I knew this wasn't about money anymore. It never had been. It was about respect. About finally forcing them to see me not as the reckless daughter who had thrown her life away, but as the woman whose choices had real power, power they couldn't deny even as they lost everything. Meanwhile, my own life grew. My business surged past 6 figures. I signed a lease for a downtown loft with exposed brick and wide windows that flooded the space with light. I hired my first assistant. I landed a wholesale contract with a national retailer who wanted my candles in stores across the country. And yet, on quiet nights when the city hummed below me, I would think about that little house on Birch Run Road, the porch swing, the off-center family photos in the hallway. I would picture my mother standing in the kitchen, twisting a dish towel in her hands, and my father staring at me with that mix of anger and disbelief. I loved them. That truth never changed, even if it broke me to admit it. But sometimes love isn't enough. Not when respect is absent, not when pride is a wall that blocks everything else. I learned something in those weeks. Something I'd never forget. Sometimes the most devastating revenge isn't what you do for people. It's what you stop doing. And in that silence, in the absence of rescue, you finally see who they really are and who you really are too.